In this video, we're taking a look at a rather unusual lens from a company with a rather unusual name. Astrhori. Astrhori? I'll go with Astrhori. This is an 85mm f2.8 macro lens. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's not that unusual, Dave. There's plenty of other macro lenses around, some with even longer than an 85mm focal length. So what is so special about this? Well, first off, you will notice that there is rather a large box section here. Now, this is because it is a tilt macro lens. What, you might be saying? A tilt macro lens, similar to a tilt shift lens, except it doesn't have the shift capabilities. There are 3 thumb screws on this lens. The first one unlocks the shift mechanism. The second one allows you to fine-tune the shift mechanism rather than just wiggle it around wildly by hand. And then the third one is on the back here that lets you rotate the entire lens round on the camera body. And what this allows you to do is set the lens at an angle to the rest of the body and then orientate it in whatever direction you want it to be. And you might be thinking, what in God's name would you possibly want to do that for? I know I used to think the same thing. All lenses' focal plane run perpendicular to the face of the lens. So if you have the camera and the lens like this, the focal plane runs like this. So everything that is on that focal plane is going to be in focus. Anything that is off that focal plane will start to drift out of focus. Now, especially when you're dealing with macro photography, the depths of field are incredibly shallow. Even stop down to f8, f11, when you're at very close focusing distances, especially with a lens like this, the depths of field are razor thin. Now, if you've got a subject that is completely perpendicular to the camera, then great. The whole thing's going to be in focus. But what if you've got a subject that's not sitting perfectly perpendicular to the camera? Well, you obviously could move the camera, might not be an option. A lens like this allows you some flexibility with that. As you tilt the lens around, the focal plane is going to stay perpendicular to the lens, but the lens is no longer perpendicular to the camera. So the focal plane is actually getting angled. Now this allows you to either set the focal plane to run in the same direction as your subject, so more of it can go in focus, or you can set it in the other direction and have the focal plane going against the direction of your subject, so you have an even shallower depth of field. This is what gives that miniature effect that you might have seen, where people will create very shallow depths of field using a shift lens, even with wider fields of view and subjects that are much further away. This is how it's being done. Now, I will apologise, I am being slightly deceptive here by mounting this on an A7 III, because this technically is an APS-C lens. However, with tilt lenses like this, because the optics, when they're being tilted, are actually shifting the image circle around, the image circle has to be big enough that when it's being tilted, it still falls completely over the image sensor, which means the image circle projected from this is enormous compared to that of an APS-C sensor, which means the image circle is still more than big enough to fully cover a full frame sensor. So even though this is an APS-C lens, you can use it on a full frame camera as a normal 85mm. Where the downside comes in, however, is when you start to tilt the lens, it very quickly falls off the image sensor and you get very dark edges. You can get a little bit of tilt, but nowhere near as much as you would be able to on an APS-C camera or shooting in a cropped mode. But in reality, this is not the only tilt lens on the market. It's not even the only tilt macro lens. However, I do think it's possibly the only or one of very few with such a long focal length. Most of the ones I seem to be able to recall are much shorter focal lengths. So anyway, let's talk about this lens specifically. Where to begin? It's an entirely metal lens, so it is built like a tank. Is it light, you might ask? Yes, in relation to, say, a small cruise ship. It weighs about 700, in fact, it weighs just over 700 grams. So it would certainly be very hard to miss if this thing happened to just disappear off the end of your camera. All metal construction, but as far as I can tell, no weather sealing. All manual, completely dumb lens. Manual aperture ring, manual focus ring, and no electronic contacts on the back. Aperture ring is completely declicked. Goes from f2.8 down to f16. There's a bit of dampening to it, but not a huge amount, and it butts right up against the focus ring. Now, there is a gap between the grips for the two rings, but there's not a gap between the rings themselves. So when you go to grab the focus ring, if you grab it right at the front, it is possible to just nudge up against the aperture ring and inadvertently rotate that as well. And you will be hard pressed to notice that because the aperture ring isn't clicked, and it's also got about the same level of dampening as the focus ring. So unless you are looking directly at the lens at the time, you might fail to notice that. It is worth noting that the focus throw on this lens is clearly geared more towards macro shooting, with the majority of the focus ring covering everything closer than 1 meter. For subjects that are further away, the focus throw is very, very small, and getting far away subjects perfectly in focus can be extremely difficult at times. Just behind that, you then have the tilt mechanism with all the controls to it. Now, the rotator mechanism has actually got a subtle click to it. It's not a very obvious... You are just roasting, aren't you? Not a very obvious one, but just enough that lets you know that you are rotating it and give you a rough idea of where it is. You get 4 clicks per 90 degrees. So 16 clicks in a full 360 degrees, which is about 11.2 degrees per click. The next big thing, though, about this rotator is you have to make sure that this nut is completely tightened. Well, go on then. Yes, you have to make sure it's completely tightened, because otherwise when you try and unmount the lens from the body, it would rotate just the front section and not the actual mounting plate. Or you have to be able to try and grip just the back ring itself, which up against the camera body can be a little tricky to get hold of. So having that tilt capability just opens up so much more creative scope with this lens. It has a 1:1 reproduction ratio and an 85mm focal length, so it can already get incredibly close to subjects. It can also work all the way out to infinity, so you can use it either as a close-up macro lens or a regular focal length lens, much like a lot of macro lenses. But then with the tilt capabilities, it can work as a way of getting much deeper depths of field at a macro level, which is something that with macro photography is very difficult to achieve normally. Or it allows you to get ridiculously shallow depths of field and a miniature effect when you're working at more normal focal lengths. Now, bearing in mind, though, that I think this is about $300 of a lens, which, considering, full metal design and a tilt mechanism, is pretty damn good. Question is, how's the image quality? Well, sort of on the same sort of lines. When working at normal focusing distance, I found the image quality to be okay. Chromatic aberrations are pretty well controlled on this lens. Wide open at f2.8, there is some mild green and purple highlights to the out of focus areas, but nothing too distracting. But it does start to clear up as you stop down. And likewise with the flaring, there is some mild flare when shooting against bright lights wide open, but this is by no means the worst that I've ever seen from a lens. Sharpness wide open is okay. The center of the frame is reasonably sharp. The corners do drop off quite a bit. As you start to stop down, the image quality does start to come back. By f8, it's very, very sharp all the way across the frame. At more macro distances, it seems to fare slightly better. The image quality follows the same sort of trend, but it seems to improve a lot quicker earlier on. So it is clearly geared more to be a macro lens that you can use on occasion at longer focal lengths. Vignetting, there is pretty much none when you don't have the tilt mechanism. Even on a full frame camera, there's pretty much no vignetting because the image circle is just so huge. However, when you start to use the tilt mechanism, it does start to shade off some of the corners depending on which way you're going. Even I found on an APS-C or in crop mode on a full frame, when you get to the extremes of the tilt range, one side or part of the frame does start to shade up quite excessively. But there's sort of not much you can do about that. You're back again already. Gee, that was quick. You want to go, but you want to stay as well, don't you? I know. So for $300, I think this is a lens with potentially a lot of appeal to people. Because it works as a normal short telephoto lens on a full frame. It works as a tilt lens to a degree. It works as a tilt lens to a bigger degree if you're an APS-C shooter. And it's a full macro as well. So it gives you so much scope, and especially if you're someone like me who has both full frame and APS-C, or you have a very high resolution full frame body that you can shoot in a crop mode and still get very detailed shots, a lens like this might be something really worth considering because it lets you switch up and get so creative with, do you go macro, do you go tilt, do you go tilt and macro, do you just use it as a normal telephoto? You know, it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. The image quality, wide open, does lack in areas, but that's not unusual for a $300 lens. There's no weather sealing. It's a completely manual lens. Again, not unusual for a $300 lens. The controls are a little fiddly. They take a little bit of getting used to, and there are times where you will want to hurl this at a window. Please don't know, because given the 700 gram weight, it will probably go through the damn thing. But overall, for $300, a very, very interesting and versatile lens, I do believe. So anyway, that concludes this video because somebody is going to pass out shortly. I don't have any links at the time of filming this. If I get some links off Astrhori for this, I will leave them in the description down below. As always, if you have any questions or queries, feel free to leave them in the comment section while you're down there. If you enjoyed this video and you haven't already done so, then please consider hitting the like and subscribe button, and hopefully we'll see you in the next video. Yes, we will go now, okay? No, okay, you're coming back up, okay. Stay here.